For over 38 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation. Julian Repke, welcome to the Build Situation Room. Alright, it's been a week since we last reported here, and we have to start with the new Russian conquests in eastern Ukraine. Specifically, these are conquests. Let's first take a look at the region as a whole, in the Donetsk area. In that area, Russia has concentrated the majority of its forces with the goal of gaining full control over the entire oblast. We'll examine 3 regions where intense battles persist and Russian troops are pushing forward. All 3 areas are situated close to Pokrovsk. Along the extensive front, stretching over 1,000 kilometers, this is a relatively small section where the Russian forces are currently pushing forward and committing a substantial portion of their troops. Nonetheless, this is one of their strategic objectives. We are already partially occupied since 2014, completely annexed in 2022, but still roughly 35% remains under Ukrainian control, the Donetsk region. That's why it's vital for the Russians to push forward here. We begin with footage from the town of Myrolyubivka, and these are, of course, Russian propaganda recordings. Very important to point that out. It's up there in the corner. TACC, the Russian state agency, published the footage. And we see this here. These are indeed areas around Myrolyubivka where the Ukrainians have been preparing, where they fully anticipated the Russian assault, which they managed to hold for quite some time. But now they've been completely overrun. At the beginning, we still see footage from the Russian army of Ukrainians moving here, retreating into the routines around the defense structures, those dragon scenes I just mentioned, moving around. And we always see typically Russian footage first, showing how the Ukrainers are there, how everything is then completely destroyed, how now they are shooting at every single building, what's under Ukrainian control, and how they then, after showing it all, once you've reported up, and they do that with such footage, reported up, how this village was destroyed, we'll then see the Russian flag being waved in various sections of Myrolyubivka, as mentioned, all of it situated near Pokrovsk, a few kilometers east of it. Now we see it, the Russians have taken over everything. It's constantly buzzing in and out, which is quite interesting, and there are more and more locations within these captured towns where the flag is being raised. The Russians are doing all this in order to counteract the Ukrainian reporting and partly also the Ukrainian propaganda, because we know that the Ukrainian army is still partly days, even weeks later, they still insist on a presence here, claiming to fight within the city itself. The Russians try, with such footage, to zoom in and out repeatedly, aiming to demonstrate that they are virtually present in every corner of this settlement, within this village, repeatedly showing this area is now completely under our control. We're going to look at this in a moment. In a different location, it's still not 100%, meaning we often still have the situation where after these flag-raising shots, the Ukrainers have gone back in and at least attempted to regain control of the area, to continue resistance within the previously briefly occupied towns. Let's take another look at the map again. As mentioned, we're currently situated roughly in the Pokrovsk region. Here's Pokrovsk on the left side, once home to 65,000 residents. Now, only about 5,000 are thought to remain. Nearby Mironok was also sizable, once home to 41,000. And what we've just witnessed were recordings from right here in Myrolyubivka. And these on this map here from our map provider, Deep State Map, is still a bit outdated, likely reflecting the current state from approximately 4 days ago. However, we can currently say that Myrolyubivka has been completely taken over by the Russian army and is now under Russian control. And all of this makes it increasingly difficult for Ukraine, as we can see here in more detail. For months now, attempts have been made to flank Pokrovsk from the south, to advance further here, also to cut off the E50, the highway to Dnepropetrovsk. That didn't work out. So, the new idea the Russians have, which unfortunately is proving very successful, is the flanking maneuver, the encirclement of Pokrovsk through the northern flank. And here, as we've demonstrated over the past few days, they've effectively reclaimed this entire northern region within approximately the last 6 weeks. This area was essentially taken back. All of this was brought under Russian control in just 6 weeks. This means the Russian offensive has been relatively successful and now extends across an area of nearly 20 kilometers. This N32 between Munchvad on one side and Konstantinovka, which is only roughly indicated up there, the entire area here has been brought under control. But not just east of Pokrovsk, the Russians are pushing further, also to the south. We're taking a look at additional footage from the city of Bahatir. Once more, we're faced with the typical imagery used by Russian propagandists. First, they show how the entire city is destroyed, with each building held by the Ukrainians being systematically obliterated and bombed. Let's take a look. Drones in general, we also see those are massive explosions, so it's not just small kamikaze drones, but this is artillery. These are airstrikes that have landed here on Bahatur. And then, right after the entire operation was thoroughly documented, we're about to see the precise approach they took here. We'll see right now how the Russian army is raising the flag in different sections of Bahatur, marking their presence across the area. We're seeing what was once a small town, I'd say, with roughly 2,000 residents living there, relatively spread out, and we can see how the Russians took over the whole area there. What we're not seeing here, of course, are also the recordings of a significant number of Ukrainian lives lost. Of course, the Ukrainians put up strong resistance here, and this drone footage we've just seen also demonstrates how Ukrainian soldiers are being killed. We can spare ourselves that here, as we can clearly see the sheer force with which the Russians are attacking, and we also see the full outcome of the conquest. Interestingly, and we'll see this right at the end, it's also the Ukrainians who have managed in part to push back here, engaging in a kind of back and forth within the town, essentially moving south again. We'll take a look at the map shortly, showing their advance southward. Here's footage from a Ukrainian drone where someone is proudly trampling on the Russian flag. Just to demonstrate, we've also taken decisive action here, so we're not just retreating, we're not merely moving back or northwest, but we've also made a significant return to raise our flag here again. Currently, and we'll see this on the map in just a moment, it's not entirely clear. Who controls the small town? The Russians have officially declared through the Ministry of Defense that they have now gained full control over the area, with the Ukrainians completely under their command. And the flag reflects that. They counter, saying that, as you can see here, the entire area of the city, they counter saying that they are still fighting in large parts of the city, still fighting. That nothing is firmly under Russian control, but rather that, as we can also see here at the front, from Oleksivka, there are repeated attempts to recapture Bahatur. We've just witnessed that in the Ukrainian footage. To some extent, the Ukrainians have managed to succeed. However, we don't know exactly how recent these are, so it's entirely possible that the Ukrainians reclaimed part of the city maybe 3, 4, 5 days ago. But by now the Russians have already advanced further here again. From Bahatur, we go about 50 kilometers further west, but still remain in the Donetsk region and see that the Russian army has also advanced further here, this time actually creating a rather interesting propaganda map. They essentially want to do our work for us and show it. We see it here, the whole thing is moving through this small village called Vilnyapolye, advancing westward, and we can clearly observe that the Russians essentially want to show us where they are positioned throughout the city. Here we don't just see the flag, but the Russians also zoom out and simultaneously show us with this marker here that this is the very house they have successfully taken over. Next, we'll see another shot, which clearly demonstrates that the Russian army has also made it to the far western part of Vilna-Poln. So here, as mentioned, this is absolutely crucial now. It must not be overlooked. It's all part of the propaganda, but it's also fundamentally about making sure that people actually believe it. The Russians are well aware, of course, that they're only partly trusted, even within their own population and their own general staff. That's precisely why it's absolutely crucial for the Russian army to produce videos that clearly show, so to speak, that they've completely taken control of the entire village. As the Russian army had already announced days ago, they've conquered it. Let's take a quick look at the map too. So we see that we're still advancing toward Donetsk, but we're now staying here at the very western edge of the Donetsk region, where Luka Novosilka was already taken during the winter. And what we've just seen were footage from Vilna-Poldy, which continues to remain, as shown on this map, not under Russian control. We can observe the orange gradually advancing here. However, it's worth noting that this map remains quite conservative. We mustn't forget, Deep State Map is a pro-Ukrainian source. So as long as they claim they're still fighting or have pushed the Russians back again, we saw it with the flag. As long as that's the case, this map will continue to remain very cautious about Russian territorial gains. The Russian military maps, of course, look a bit different. Nevertheless, we see in these locations we just mentioned, in Donetsk, including in Pokrovsk, as well as further south in Badhir, the area around Kuracheve, as well as here in the southwest of the Donetsk region, they are steadily making progress toward the oblast boundaries. That means they are getting closer and closer to the borders of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia in the center and south of the country. And the conquests, as mentioned, are definitely continuing here. All of this, of course, continues to cost the Russians many men and a lot of equipment. And here we want to look at current videos that don't showcase the Russian propaganda of how everything was conquered, but rather show what happened beforehand. We only see that partially in the Russian videos, of course, and now once again we're seeing how here, Russian soldiers are being chased by the Ukrainians in these completely destroyed towns, even after they've captured them, and there, by the dozens, by the hundreds, here we witness Russian soldiers cautiously and deliberately advancing, slowly making their way toward one of their final refuges, located in a strikingly and utterly devastated setting. After all, the Russians need to sleep somewhere to spend the night. That's what they do, in the basements of partially or even completely destroyed houses. We're seeing it here below. I hope you can make it out. This right here is still the basement entrance of a house. The house no longer exists, but the Russians are going, well, we see it here, one by one into this cellar entrance. Up there come more Russians. Everyone is taking shelter in that one cellar because it was identified as a potentially secure spot. There we see it in a former house that no longer exists. The Ukrainians observe the situation with their ISR drones, their reconnaissance drones, first assessing where the Russians are going in. And now we see how one after another, kamikaze drone after kamikaze drone, flies into that basement. And we can see it relatively well here in the footage. We've already witnessed a partial collapse of this basement, and now there are even more drones attempting to fly directly into the structure once again. So that the Russians, yes, it has to be said plainly, are effectively buried alive in this hideout they've chosen. We don't know if it succeeded. We can only see how the Ukrainians are proceeding. Another attack on Russian infantry we are witnessing here, and it is particularly noteworthy and intriguing. Here, a Ukrainian drone essentially observed where the Russian kamikaze drones were coming from and tracked them back. The main aim is to figure out where they're coming from. We know they're targeting our troops, but the crucial question is, where exactly do they originate from? So you take a look at the whole thing, check out the buildings where they're coming from, and then basically trace back the entire route the Russian drones have taken, and in this case, it worked. By tracking these drones, we can now clearly identify and pinpoint this specific building. Of course, these are just animations, but we can see it right here at this spot. That's exactly where the roof used to be located, partially open, and there you can see the antennas sticking out. The Russian antennas used to control these FPV kamikaze drones. All of this is now being shown by the Ukrainians, which are about to launch massive attacks on this building right now, as we can see again, so that the Russian kamikaze unit, the FPV kamikaze drone unit there, is likely to be severely damaged or, judging by the sheer scale of these attacks, probably even almost entirely wiped out completely. So we see the Ukrainians are hunting down Russian infantry, even at the cost of losing territory in the process, but that has been the Ukrainian strategy for years. They try to lose as few men as possible, to have as little direct confrontation with the Russians as possible, but instead they slowly withdraw and aim to kill as many Russian soldiers as possible. And not just soldiers are being killed from the Russian army, but also tanks that are being destroyed. We've also discussed this repeatedly in recent weeks. From January to around mid-April, the Russian army had hardly any tanks at the front. The situation changed about a month ago. That means they essentially moved in reinforcements first. They've trained troops from across all of Russia, essentially on the tanks, as you would naturally expect. They trained there extensively, and now they have both fresh soldiers and brand new tanks at the front. And here we see one of these tanks, namely a T-72B3, a relatively modern tank that has also been upgraded, which is being pursued here by a drone from the Russian army. We can see up there that the Russians are still trying to reach safety. However, they don't succeed in doing so. Instead, we see that this is a fatal hit here. Ukraine's 92nd Brigade effectively managed to pulverize this T-72. Zrenia, there's really nothing left of it because both the ammunition and the fuel exploded all at once, leaving nothing behind. Here's more footage, likely, if I'm not mistaken, from Kharkiv. And here we see from the 3rd Assault Brigade. Reports, or rather footage, of how the tanks being driven to the front are also attacked when they come to a halt somewhere. Interestingly, here you also see the Russian tricolor painted on the tank barrel. It didn't do much good for this tank in the end, and we can clearly see how logistics are being targeted as well. Again, it's quite interesting to see here. At the end, the soldiers probably don't get harmed because they've all already gotten out of the Buchanki, this small bus here. But they're still attempting to shoot it down, firing at the Ukrainian drone, which ultimately ends up striking the vehicle directly without any delay. And so it's not only soldiers of the Russian Federation who are losing their lives in this ongoing conflict. As we mentioned earlier, of course, Ukrainians are also losing their lives naturally in the defense, but it's also a significant number of vehicles that are being destroyed here daily by the Ukrainian units, who are making efforts to repel the Russians with as little risk as possible to their own forces, both directly along the front lines and in areas situated far behind the immediate battle zones. And the remarkable success of Ukrainian attacks, even far behind the front lines, is largely attributed to materials supplied by Germany. And we want to take a closer look at one of them, something we haven't done much of yet, namely the Vector drone, a reconnaissance drone from the German company Quantum Systems, which is being deployed in Ukraine. A highly successful model, over 700 units have been sent to Ukraine at the expense of the German federal government. And now we'll take a look at their deployment against Russian targets behind the front lines. And the special thing, of course, is that we're dealing with a reconnaissance drone here. It doesn't carry any weapons itself, but it precisely coordinates the firepower of the Ukrainian army with remarkable efficiency and precision. Here we are observing footage captured by a vector drone recorded in the vicinity of Zoraya, situated approximately 20 kilometers behind the front lines. The vector drone is fully operational here, filming the entire time, first conducting reconnaissance, and then here a ABM-21 Grad launcher belonging to the Russian army has been spotted and is now under attack by kamikaze drones from the Ukrainian forces. We can see that the entire operation is being carefully coordinated as the coordinates are being relayed in real time to the Ukrainian combat commands, and naturally the extent of the damage is also being thoroughly evaluated, each by these small FPV drones. It takes a substantial number of these kamikaze drones, striking in rapid succession one after the other. The footage from mid-April, as mentioned, 20 kilometers behind the front, and the special thing is the Ukrainians could only briefly see the whole situation with their kamikaze drones and would then have to... The image cuts off right at the moment of impact, leaving them without any further information afterward. The unique aspect is that the vector drone can remain active for several hours, roughly 40 to 60 kilometers behind the front, and can continuously supply real-time data throughout that entire duration. What happens? And in the end, what we've seen many times happens, namely the 5th or 6th or 7th kamikaze drone of the Ukrainers manages to make it through, to successfully manage to trigger the explosion of the Grad rockets still loaded in the tubes here. We've talked about this before. Nevertheless, it's very important to note again that it's a BM-21 with a maximum range of about 20 kilometers. The vector drone has absolutely no problem with it to track the entire thing for hours, but the Ukrainian kamikaze drones are also now capable, if you give them the exact coordinates, so they can't search the area, but they must fly straight ahead when given the coordinates, operating 20 kilometers behind the front lines, striking with precision and efficiency. We can clearly see it. There's really nothing left at all of this ridge launcher whatsoever. What we just observed were highly precise attacks on a static target, specifically a stationary one, which had effectively been immobilized beforehand to prevent it from moving any further, namely this ridge launcher. However, the vector drone is also fully capable of tracking Russian targets on the ground. And here too, we have new material, interestingly from the same day and the same brigade, namely the 35th Magrini Brigade of the Ukrainian armed forces, and we're now seeing this up close. We'll also take a look at the map shortly, analyze all of this in a bit more detail. Up close footage, which was captured on the very same day as mentioned, and here moving just now, is a Russian army unit advancing directly toward the frontline position. There are 2 escort vehicles here, one ahead, one behind. Once more, we're looking at civilian vehicles, but the crucial detail lies in the middle. There's what appears to be a Kamaz or Ural truck, noticeable by its triangular light, and it's also towing something behind it, which is most likely an artillery piece, probably an anti-tank gun, because we can see right away that it's being driven relatively close to the front line. Let's let it play out and observe how everything unfolds. This means the vector drone is spotting it, and it's already positioned very, very far behind the front line. About 40 kilometers behind the front line, it has already been fully reconnoitered. Could then pass on the information to Ukraine. Attention, something is approaching your position, and as a result, the Ukrainian army was able to take immediate action. Now we see how this vehicle we just observed, specifically this Kamaz truck, is presumably delivering and unloading its anti-tank cannon right at this location, very close to the front, only about 2 kilometers away. And we can clearly observe one after the other the kamikaze drone strikes being executed here, precisely and relentlessly targeting this truck. The entire operation is monitored and controlled by the vector drone, which continuously provides this damage assessment and of course would now also alert if there were an evacuation here or if supplies were coming in. However, in this specific instance, we can observe that the Kamaz truck and this artillery position are being targeted and effectively destroyed by individual kamikaze drones. We want to take a look at the whole thing on the map. It's actually quite interesting to see how everything unfolded. As mentioned, the entire event actually occurred or unfolded right around the middle of April. And we actually noticed on one hand that the BM-21 was targeted here near Soria. Let's take a look at the whole thing. As I mentioned up there, that's 7 kilometers. That means we were... At that time, the front was still a bit further to the east. That means we were positioned about here, roughly 20 kilometers behind the front, as I had mentioned. That was the maximum range of the BM-21. But it posed no problem for the vector drone at all. And the second thing, which I find even more interesting, was that the same drone observed on the same day how the Russians, in the area of Dzurka Runa, we had this convoy, that we saw this column at the start advancing towards the front lines. That means the Russians have tried to avoid the main roads. We've seen that they've been near... They moved through forest clearings. Main roads are closely monitored by smaller Ukrainian drones. But to conduct reconnaissance so deep in enemy territory, we're talking about almost 40 kilometers behind the current front line, you really need these medium-range drones, among others, which have been supplied from Germany, as I mentioned earlier, which are crucial for reconnaissance. And the whole thing, as I mentioned, was that from here you had access to the information. The Russians then advanced. The front was here in Zibre and in Srebrenica, they were ultimately attacked. That means this entire movement, the Russian army, including both the BM-21 and the column that was advancing in that particular area, was likely reconnoitered by, at the very least, a single vector drone, which then provided the data accordingly, allowing the Ukrainians to target both the multiple rocket launcher and this anti-tank unit that was in Ukraine. Close to the front was transported and could defend this particular area with exceptional efficiency. Yet Russia too deploys medium-range drones, not just Ukraine, and here we have very recent footage which clearly shows how the Russians attempted to deploy armed drones toward the front lines, only to be intercepted and successfully repelled by Ukrainian defensive forces. The drone we're seeing here looks a bit odd, but it's actually very effective because it has everything you need. It can fly, of course, it has a battery, and it also carries heavy weaponry. We'll take a closer look at it in just a moment. Even though in other cases there are really just bars installed here sometimes, as you can see. We can see right through this drone. It's named Molnia, a relatively modern or at least recently deployed Russian kamikaze drone designed specifically for precision strikes, which is currently under attack and being targeted by various Ukrainian units right now. First of all, we see, if I'm not mistaken, the 12th Special Forces Brigade of the Ukrainian National Guard, Azov, attacking here, essentially using their FPV kamikaze drones. Carrying out these ram attacks with a bit of explosives on board these small drones, and now here, the whole thing is being targeted. And as I just mentioned, this is a relatively heavy armament. We have here at the front at least something that looks like an anti-tank mine. So it's most likely a TM62 that was installed here, and to ensure the drone doesn't tip forward during operation, the battery was deliberately positioned quite far back in this particular section of the device. Normally the battery is placed in the drone's center. Here it's not. The battery is basically attached as a counterweight at the back so that these drones can fly. We are just seeing various of these drones which are repeatedly being attacked. And all of them, or at least a significant number of these drones, have anti-tank mines securely attached to the front using gaffer tape or similar methods, which are essentially designed to fly directly into the target here. We also see some are equipped with anti-personnel explosives. Here, for example, we can see that's something completely different, a forward-facing mine that's mainly intended to target personnel. These are truly very fascinating recordings because they clearly reveal, by the way, yet another new drone of the Russians as they effectively demonstrate how, well, if you will, how crowded the sky is over Ukraine. Here now is another group, slightly lower in quality, but they too are actively pursuing Molnia drones and other related drones of the Russian army. So essentially what we're seeing is both Ukrainians and Russians continuously attempting to penetrate behind enemy lines using either reconnaissance drones or kamikaze drones. They're also trying, and we know that the Russians are sometimes succeeding in doing so, striking 30 kilometers behind the front line with these small drones here, and each side is now actively attempting, this is true for both sides, to deploy their own small FPV kamikaze drones to intercept and neutralize the opposing kamikaze drone threats. In the end, we aim to head into Russia, or more precisely, the Russian-occupied territories, and here we have some striking new footage from the Ukrainian army that's quite revealing, because they clearly illustrate just how remarkably strange some Russians' attitude toward their own lives and this ongoing conflict really seems to be. Here we see footage from Guevo. We begin here with this footage from Guevo. This is one of the border villages in Kursk, which until quite recently had been under Ukrainian control. And here we see footage of the now almost famous vodka distillery in Guevo. Because this vodka distillery is the largest building in the village, was under Ukrainian control for years and was ultimately bombed by the Russians. Now it's under Russian control, and we're about to witness that it's being targeted by Ukrainian forces. The interesting part is the Russians here appear to have realized they are being surveilled. That means they've spotted the Ukrainian drone and are now waving at it, clearly finding it quite amusing that they're being watched or monitored in this situation. So we see it there, that's the window. This here is the vodka distillery, already heavily damaged, primarily from Russian airstrikes over the past few months. And we see that the Ukrainians have now realized there aren't just numerous Russian soldiers outside, but also quite a few positioned inside. Here we see it, still relatively clear and well visible, that despite being partially damaged, it remains by far the largest structure in the entire area, compared to everything else you can find in Guevo. What the Russians didn't realize at the time, as they were waving around, is that the Ukrainians had more than just small reconnaissance drones ready, but also that the Ukrainian Air Force remains active in the vicinity, and we are now witnessing a MiG-29 attack with a 250-kilogram bomb of French production, nicknamed the Hammer. And we can clearly see that this vodka distillery is now being heavily bombarded here. We can see various explosions, which lead to that after the Russian bombs, now in this case French or Ukrainian bombs are also falling on it, and the soldiers stationed there are under heavy fire, who were just waving are probably now in a significantly worse state than before. Finally, we head into the Russian-occupied territories, specifically Crimea, where we have new footage from this weekend showing the Ukrainian army once again carrying out an attack using long-range drones, specifically targeting an ammunition depot, also a barracks of the Russian army in Pervomayskoye, Crimea. Here's what we're seeing right now. The locals became alert right after the first impacts hit. Now we're seeing it simmering there, slowly unfolding. We can clearly see the smoke billowing from the facility. Now the first flames have appeared, accompanied by secondary explosions. However, what we're about to see is that the fire, apparently, Zrenia is consuming the safety measures of the ammunition stored there. And now, here's the massive explosion in Crimea. This means the Ukrainians continue to attempt using their long-range drones, or at least medium-range drones, in this case probably around 500 kilometers range, to hit the Russians far behind the front lines, in this case in occupied Crimea, because of course logistics have been continuously maintained from there as well. Also weapons, ammunition, and men have been continuously directed towards Kherson and Zaporizhzhia in southern Ukraine.